Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to this edition of Framing the Future. My name is Gary Allen. I'm the president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation. It's our privilege to bring this series to you each month on the third Thursday of each month. We've always tried to pick timely and useful topics for public discussion about issues that will affect the future of forestry in Maryland and in our surrounding Chesapeake Bay region. This week's topic is no exception. As a matter of fact, it probably underlines and underscores the validity and importance of a series like this to bring to your attention the emerging issues that are likely to particularly dominate conversations in the year ahead. I'm very pleased to have as our moderator for these discussions Megan Carr. Megan was our first Mel Fellow. Mel Fellowships are just beginning in. As a matter of fact, we'll be talking about those in the months ahead. I want to remind you that this session is being recorded. It will be available on the MarylandForestryFoundation.org website in about a week after this webinar is concluded. With that in mind, let me turn it over to our moderator, Megan Carr, to introduce today's panelists. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Gary. And yeah, welcome everyone. Just a few brief housekeeping notes as we are getting started. We welcome participation from our audience members today, and your means for doing that is via the Q&A function within Zoom. So please feel welcome to enter your questions throughout the day. We will have time at the end of our session, around 10 to 15 minutes, for our speakers to address your questions. We will hold those questions until then, and I will read those aloud so that they are on record for our folks that are viewing the video of this webinar later on. So with that, we'll go ahead and start the discussion and lead off with Kyle Hart. Kyle grew up in Southern Virginia, spending every possible minute hunting, fishing, hiking, and camping in the rolling hills and forests around his home. He graduated from Hampton-Sydney College in 2016 with a degree in political science and biology, and has worked for various environmental nonprofits ever since, including the Virginia League of Conservation Voters and the Virginia Conservation Network. He joined the National Parks Conservation Association in early 2020. He brings with him to his role a passion for the natural world and all things wild. He lives near Richmond, Virginia with his wife, Janessa, and their dog, Graham. So welcome, Kyle.
Thank you, Megan. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint presentation for folks, and we will jump right in. So thank you, Megan and Gary. I'm super honored to be here today to talk about an issue that over the past 4 years, I have been either fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, to become immersed in and spend a lot of my sort of time working on, and that is data centers. I'm going to do a bit of kind of like a data center 101, if you will, today, which will include an overview of what data centers are, what some of the environmental issues are, and also kind of like what has happened and what is happening in the state of Virginia. I think it's very important to kind of set the stage, and then I'm going to turn it over to my friend and coworker Anna Mudd with the Potomac Conservancy to kind of give a state of play for Maryland. As Megan mentioned, I am from Virginia. I live in Richmond, Virginia. So while I know this issue, the issue of data centers, very well, I do not know the issue of Maryland politics as well as folks like Anna. So I'm going to let Anna take the lead on that. Very quickly, to a little bit of background on NPCA and who we are. So NPCA is a national nonprofit, also known as National Parks Conservation Association. Our mission is to protect and enhance America's national parks. There are, I believe that number might actually be out of date. There's like 429 or more different distinct units of the National Park Service across the country, and NPCA works to advocate for all of them. You know, people think of national parks like Yellowstone, Yosemite, but of course, national parks also include things like the Cape Hatteras National Seashore and the Outer Banks, Manassas National Battlefield, and all kinds of other little historic sites and unique areas kind of scattered across the country. As an organization, we work across the country. I like to say if there's a national park somewhere, we are there. We're a national park. National parks are in Alaska, so we're up in Alaska, all the way down to Florida, Maine, California. We're kind of all over the place. We also have a really strong presence in the Washington, D.C. region, so that we have folks who advocate in the halls of Congress, to make sure that, the federal government is working to protect national parks as well. As an organization, we work to make sure that parks have the resources that they need to do their job. So that's park funding, as well as restoration, so that parks are able to fix buildings that have leaky roofs and that sort of thing. We work to establish new parks to more comprehensively tell the story, the American story, and we work to protect parks from threats on the ground, which is a lot of what I do, which is kind of where my background on data centers comes from. If you're interested, you can learn more about us by simply Googling National Parks Conservation Association or npca.org. I didn't include them here, but we're on all of the various social medias, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, if you're interested in finding us there. So let's start with the basics. What is a data center? In this picture, you can see, I want to call it an average data center. Technically, over time, this has become what I would consider to be a small data center. But this is a really good picture, a really good example of what a data center has and what they look like. So to start, a data center is literally just a building filled with computers. That's a wild oversimplification of the matter. But you can imagine if if you're very familiar with sort of the old desktop computers that all had a CPU on them, imagine just a warehouse filled wall to ceiling, or floor to ceiling, wall to wall with CPU units. The old model of data centers was driven mostly around data storage. I think folks are very familiar with like Microsoft Office's the cloud. You can save, or Google Drive, where sort of documents kind of live on the internet, if you will, and not necessarily on your laptop. So when a document is stored in the cloud, it's very physical. This is the cloud in real life, this concrete building. So you can see in this building, or in this picture, what this building has. And so I'll point out some of the sort of the key aspects. So on, I guess, the right side of the screen, down low, there are about 25 or so large diesel generators. And a future slide, I've actually got a really good picture of one and how big they are. They're about the size of a tractor trailer. They average approximately 3 megawatts of power. To put that into perspective, 1 megawatt of power is usually enough to power 250 homes. So each of those diesel generators could, in theory, operate 750 homes at once. And there's, like I said, about 25 of them there. Data centers also have storage. Because these are diesel generators, they're going to have large diesel tanks on the property or nearby. All of the things on top of the building, for the most part, are air conditioning units. Data centers can be cooled in a variety of ways. Some of them are water cooled, some of them are air cooled. An air cooled facility, which is what I bet this one is literally just going to have constant air conditioning units running to keep the building and the computer systems inside of it cool. I think everybody here is very familiar with, a computer or an iPhone. If you're using it for too long of a time, or you're asking it to do too many features at once, it will literally get warm to the touch. Old computers, I guess even laptops, have little fans on them to like bring and recirculate air. Once again, a data center is just that on the macro level. And of course, data centers, they're places of employment. So they've got all of these other ancillary facilities that go along with that: parking lots, roads in and out, kind of all of the whole 9 yards, water in and out, I think potable water in and out, since, people are living and not living, but, working in these buildings 12 hours a day. Data centers require, sort of at their core, 3 things, right? They require land to be on. They require water. Sometimes it's not much, sometimes it's a lot. And then they require energy. And energy is one of sort of the big topics. Data centers require a lot of energy, and we'll get into that in a minute. So Virginia is the data center capital of the world. Once again, this is probably a very old graph. So Virginia in this graph says it has about 4,500 or 4,700 operational megawatts of data centers. I believe we're currently at almost 8 or 9, and that seems to like grow more and more every day. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I'll also say across the United States and globally, this map or this graph just continues to ratchet up. Demand for data centers is through the roof. We'll talk about that in a second as well. But this is a good idea to just sort of show that Northern Virginia and sort of de facto the region, this is not necessarily a unique problem, but the scale of the problem is unique to this region. In Virginia, people like to say Virginia is the data center capital of the world. The rough statistic, depending on who you ask, is that 70% of the internet traffic, of global internet traffic, at some point interacts with the state of Virginia. There's a variety of reasons for that. Once again, I have got a slide for that, for the reasons for that in a moment, but just roughly to put this to scale, there are currently 57 million square feet built or currently being built in the state of Virginia, and then another 180 million square feet in the pipeline. We are seeing all of these projects go before localities, and every single locality is saying yes. I have been doing this work for 4 years. I have been to one hearing for a data center project where the boards of supervisors said, no, we're not interested, thank you. These projects are getting approved left, right, and center. A big reason for that is tax revenue, jobs, all of these other things. You know, the tax revenue is a big incentive for localities. The data center industry has also done a very good job at sort of advocating that these are facilities that have minimal footprints. We'll spend some time today pushing back on that notion, but that is why there's so much. In Virginia, the number that we're hearing with this total sort of build out potential of more than 200 million square feet is approximately 50 gigawatts. Now, I'm going to put that into perspective for you. So a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. As I mentioned, 1 megawatt is enough for 250 homes. So that's a lot of power. On a hot summer day, New York City uses approximately 10 gigawatts of power at peak demand. So we're talking for one industry alone in the state of Virginia, 5 New York Cities worth of power. Offshore wind farm off the state of Virginia, there's currently one under development. It's the largest in the country. It's a $10 billion project. That is set to deliver 2.6 gigawatts of power. So we would need off the coast of Virginia 20 offshore wind farms to the tune of $10 billion apiece to power just the data center industry and the data center industry alone. So to put this into perspective, Dominion Energy yesterday, so Dominion Energy is the electric monopoly in Virginia. They unveiled what's called their integrated resource plan, their IRP, where they essentially say, all right, here's how we're going to meet expected load. They're predicting between now and 2030 on almost 30 gigawatt, a 27 gigawatt increase in power in the next 7 or 8 years. They're planning to meet that with 21 gigawatts of clean energy, which is carbon free. So that's wind, solar, and nuclear is in that batch. And then an additional 5.9 gigawatts of natural gas. I think the scary thing about all that is they're planning to bring all of that new power, particularly all of that clean renewable power online, and zero is getting retired, which means, here's sort of the big scary elephant in the room. We're going to build billions of dollars in the state of Virginia worth of clean and renewable energy and actually go backwards on our climate and clean energy goals. And so the question you have to start asking yourself is like, can this amount of energy demand be built and then met by Dominion Energy in a clean and renewable fashion? And that's sort of a very difficult question to answer. So very quickly, what's driving this? The internet basically started in Northern Virginia in the 1990s, the dot-com boom, original AOL headquarters, if folks remember AOL, was in Loudoun County, Virginia. Fun fact, data centers are the new, AOL is the old. The old AOL headquarters have been torn down and are currently being torn into a data center. So that's very interesting. The proximity to Washington, D.C. is very important here. That's one of the reasons, we hear all of the time, national security concerns, all of our federal agencies like to have essentially immediate access to extensive computational power. So that's another reason. The big reason is the growth of artificial intelligence, especially generative AI, ChatGPT, all of these different companies that now offer artificial intelligence on sort of as a baseline in all of their platforms. If you go to Google and you do a Google search, you get an artificial intelligence answer automatically spit back at you. Microsoft is incorporating artificial intelligence into all of their platforms. Same thing with Amazon. All of these big tech companies are just starting to really lean on artificial intelligence. There's also a large amount of AI that we believe is speculative, people thinking that this is the future and trying to get ahead of this. Depending on who you ask, it's either the next big thing or a giant bubble. I'm by no means an industry insider, so I won't talk about that today, but that's what's driving this demand. And then very quickly, the project that I think a lot of folks have heard of, the Prince William Digital Gateway. This is the reason NPCA is so involved in this issue, is this project. You can see on the map here, everything outlined in red is a proposed data center corridor. It's about 2,100 acres of data centers, 1,600 acres of actual limits of disturbance data center facilities. So it's a pretty huge facility, 21 million square feet. It's the largest data center proposed ever globally anywhere. So this would be like 35 distinct data center buildings. So each data center building would be a little bit less than, 1 million square feet, depending on the building. So that's roughly the square footage equivalent on the ground of 4 Pentagons, to like put that into perspective. Another way to think about that is like 250 Walmart supercenters or something like that. This project, as you can see from this map, is literally directly adjacent to Manassas National Battlefield. Someone with a decent baseball throw could stand on Park Service property and plunk a baseball off of a data center. We're talking less than 100 yards. This project, we're expecting it to use 3 gigawatts of energy on the low end. Higher models are double that, 6 gigawatts of energy. Once again, to put that into perspective, the largest wind farm currently proposed off the coast of Virginia and on the East Coast is 2.6 gigawatts. So $10 billion of energy just for one project and then some. So what are the environmental impacts of data centers? We've kind of touched on some of this. So I'll start with the obvious land use impacts. Data centers need a lot of land in the state of Virginia, where, it's kind of hard to put your finger on it, but literally thousands of acres. I think a good from the hip number is 10,000 acres. That, of course, doesn't account for the energy infrastructure that's needed to power data centers. So solar, wind, power lines, nuclear, all of these other things. This is just like physical on the ground footprint, probably about 10,000 acres of land disturbed. It's the approximate, 237 million square feet. That's what I was saying is, proposed, built in the pipeline. That's the equivalent of about 1,000 Walmart supercenters. So that would be the equivalent of every single county in the state of Virginia getting 10 Walmart supercenters over the course of 10 years. That's not an insignificant amount of land lost. Growth is currently centered for a variety of reasons around green spaces and rural areas. For one, green space is easier to develop. Land is a lot cheaper in green spaces. And so we're seeing sort of redevelopment, old shopping malls getting turned into data centers. That's not really happening much anymore. What's happening is instead of redeveloping a shopping mall, they'll just go 2 miles up the road and find an old family farm. Old family farm might go, on the free market for $10,000 an acre or, $5,000 an acre, depending on where you are. Data centers will show up and pay $100,000 an acre, or in some areas, $900,000 an acre. They're just gobbling up green space. Water is a big concern. Water quality, water quantity. Quality is very obvious. Construction runoff. What happens when you build things on green spaces? You have sedimentation runoff. You have spills. You have all of that stuff. Anna might touch on this a little bit. Quantum Loophole, which is the big project in Maryland, has already had, as they're digging and installing fiber optic cable up to this site, numerous water quality violations. So construction water quality violations are not uncommon, unfortunately. And then, of course, you have, once the site is in operation, kind of turning back to that previous slide, you've essentially converted 10,000 acres of green space into impervious surface, which of course is going to, have minor oil spills from car leaks, road salts, all of the things that come with the conversion of green space to, industrial space. Then the other big thing is water quantity. I really like this picture, or hate this picture, depending on how you frame it. This is the Thornton River, which is usually, you can kind of see, usually all of those rocks are underwater. So that was a 2023 drought in Virginia. That is a tributary, one of the main feeder streams for the Rappahannock River. So it's in the Rappahannock River watershed. That stream spills out of Shenandoah National Park, which was closed to fishing for like 6 months last year because of drought. Virginia has never really had, and really the region as a whole has never had, a water quantity question. There's never been concerns about, will we have enough water? And you factor in droughts that are being driven by climate change, along with this huge demand for new water intakes to power data centers. And regulators are starting to ask these questions like, do we have enough water? And that's never been a thing. So in Virginia, FOIA request for a small handful of counties in Northern Virginia showed that in 2023, data centers used 1.85 billion gallons of water. Almost all of that was driven by Loudoun County. That number is shifting dramatically. I actually think that number is low. I think statewide, in a couple of years, we're probably looking at double or even triple that. The problem is there's no required disclosure at the moment. So we're having to do FOIA requests and kind of cobble things together. So the comprehensive picture is unclear. And then the last thing that I'll add is there's no region or basin-wide planning occurring. And so let's say you have, in Virginia, the Rappahannock watershed or the James River watershed. There's no DEQ process in the state of Virginia, the Department of Environmental Quality process, to ensure that water withdrawals that are happening across the watershed all the way down to where it becomes tidal or saltwater aren't having a negative impact. There's not a comprehensive plan for what we want water intakes or water withdrawals for the next 10 or 15 or 25 years to look like. And that's definitely not happening overlaid with climate change droughts. So of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the MPRP, or the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project, but you have to get power to data centers in Virginia. This map you can see is 3 sort of large scale projects, all more or less dead ending in Northern Virginia, current Data Center Alley. This is what's called the sort of the Mid-Atlantic NITSE, or National Interest Electric Transmission Corridor projects. That's a $5.2 billion infrastructure upgrade that PJM and federal agencies have broadly admitted is solely to power the data center industry, and the data center industry alone. There's a bunch of other transmission projects that are happening nationwide that are designed to bring new large renewable energy projects, that power to population centers. And that is generally something that conservation organizations are willing to work with developers on, because it means reducing our carbon footprint. However, this is not doing that. This is literally shipping coal power and natural gas power from various places in West Virginia and Maryland, or West Virginia and Pennsylvania, to Data Center Alley. And that's a real problem for us. You can see pretty clearly in the sort of West Virginia portion of this map, that hyphenated line is line upgrades. So it's not a new corridor, but upgrades to an existing corridor and bringing more coal-fired power from a plant that was planned to shut down into Data Center Alley. And then also that hard, firm purple line is the MPRB. So last but not least, air quality and climate change. That is one of the diesel generators that I was talking about at the beginning of this call. They are massive. They're not small. Diesel generators in current capacity, you're seeing 100 or more at a site. I think Anna's going to talk a little bit about the bill that passed in the governor's this year that was driven because data centers in Maryland did not want to get a particular state approval process from Maryland. And so essentially we're going to see at certain sites, at the Quantum Loophole site, hundreds, literally hundreds, 300 or more diesel generators of this size sort of installed. In Loudoun County alone, there's more than 4,000 of these things. We're expecting, we're working to get a fuller picture from the state of Virginia, but we're expecting upwards of 7,000 or 8,000 across the state. And of course, data centers need a lot of power. Currently, we're seeing a nationwide delay of coal-fired power plants being retired. This is happening in lots of places. I got forwarded news articles yesterday about it happening in Ohio and Indiana and West Virginia. It's happening everywhere. And what's happening is new or electric utilities like Dominion Energy are planning to bring online new natural gas and not retire old facilities. So collectively, you get dirtier air, climate change, and water and land concerns. So that about does it for me. I'm going to stop my share and turn it over to Megan and Anna. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you very much, Kyle. That was really informative background. And I'm sure we will have a lot of questions related coming in. As a reminder, and for folks who joined us a little late, if you do have questions for our panelists, please do enter those into the Q&A function via Zoom, and we will address those at the end of our session. But for now, we are joined by Anna Mudd. So Anna joined Potomac Conservancy as the Senior Director of Policy in 2022. In this role, she advocates for public policies that prioritize the nexus of clean water and environmental justice in Maryland and Virginia. An experienced strategist, Anna interacts with elected officials, relevant government agencies, and other decision makers, and also serves as the primary liaison with partner organizations and coalitions in the environmental policy space. Before joining Team Potomac, Anna spent several years working in local and state government and nonprofit advocacy. She's a Maryland native and currently resides in Annapolis. Thanks for being here, Anna.
Thanks, Megan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So just bear with me. All right. All right. So I think, are we good to go, Megan? Does that
Looks
look good to
great.
you? Okay, great. Well, everyone, thanks for joining today. My name's Anna Mudd. I've been with Potomac Conservancy for about 2 years, and I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in Maryland specifically. So just to give you a little bit of background about Potomac Conservancy, we've been around for about 30 years. We were originally started as a land trust organization. We still hold a lot of conservation easements in the Potomac headwaters, mostly in Virginia and West Virginia. But over the years, we've kind of evolved into doing all kinds of work in the Potomac watershed to support our mission, which is basically to protect the Potomac River. So we protect and restore Potomac lands and waters through our conservation easements. We have a pretty large team that handles that. We also have a lot of community engagement activities, specifically trash and litter cleanups. So if you live in the DC metro area, you may be familiar with a lot of the trash and litter cleanups we do in the region. But what I handle mostly is our advocacy work. You can see in this little bubble here on the end, we do a lot of work on the state and local level, mostly around land and water conservation and protection. So I first heard about data centers back in 2023. I was attending the Choose Clean Water conference, and Potomac watershed is obviously both in Maryland and Virginia, specifically Northern Virginia, where a lot of our members reside. I saw that Kyle Hart had a presentation about data centers in Northern Virginia, and I thought, oh, that'll be really interesting. And he gave basically that presentation that you all just heard. And he had kind of this ominous message to us at the end, which is, if you haven't heard about data centers popping up in your community, you will soon. So sure enough, later that year, we started hearing about data centers happening in Frederick County specifically. So just to give you guys a little bit of background, Maryland already has, and this is an outdated number, has data centers, right? They're usually smaller in scale. They're connected to hospitals, to school systems. We have a few that are connected to federal agencies like Fannie Mae, Social Security Administration. But the state got the attention of the data center industry back in 2020 when they basically passed legislation that offered some tax incentives to the industry. This legislation was really similar to bills that had already been passed in 30 other states. So about a year later, a company called Quantum Loophole bought a lot of land in Frederick County. They bought a huge industrial zoned lot, several thousand acres, to build what is now, we've seen in Northern Virginia, the massive data center campus. So this is, Kyle already gave you some reasons why the data center industry is attracted to this region of the world. And they are, I speculate that they're probably starting to run out of room or in Virginia. And so they're moving across the river into Maryland here. And that with the tax incentives, I think made Frederick County a good target. As Kyle mentioned, there's already been multiple permit violations with the construction of the data centers that's going in right now. I think there was a lawsuit recently that cited over 80 permit violations. MDE has been handing out as far as enforcement or consequence. We still haven't really seen a lot of consequence there, but we're hopeful that MDE is paying attention now. There's also been a lot of significant concern among community members. I think Steve Black is on this call. Steve has been leading a pretty significant effort among local groups in Frederick County specifically to kind of push back on this idea that, data centers can go up anywhere they want. So the great news about I guess the silver lining, I should say, of all this construction is that it's getting a lot of attention in the press. Washington Post has been covering this. Maryland Matters has been covering this pretty significantly as well. So I cited a source down here where in Maryland Matters article that talks about Quantum Loophole project specifically. So let me move on here. So, while this is happening in Frederick County, this new data center has been proposed and this huge campus has been acquired. We as Maryland advocates, environmental advocates, were kind of blindsided in 2024. The Maryland General Assembly session, which goes from January through April, the Moore administration requested legislation put on called the Critical Infrastructure Streamlining Act of 2024 that basically allows data centers to override or not have to go through the traditional process when it comes specifically to diesel generators. You guys remember seeing that picture that Kyle showed you of those school bus sized generators? Well, Quantum Loophole wanted over 160 of those on their campus. Public Service Commission in Maryland said, you're going to have to do better, come back to us with a new plan. They didn't like that. And they have some allies in Annapolis that help them push through legislation that basically allows them to become exempt from that process. The legislation passed almost unanimously in Maryland. A lot of Maryland legislators are really excited about this idea about that data centers will bring pretty significant tax windfall for local government. So I just want to make it clear there that, there are some economic reasons why, local government is so, and state government are so excited about this industry. But so that kind of gets us to where we're at now. So 2024 legislative session ends. We weren't successful in stopping that legislation. So basically, regulations have been loosened, and now we're hearing about this Piedmont Reliability Project, which is basically a 78-mile tract of land that goes through several Maryland counties, Baltimore, Carroll, Frederick counties, that is to build transmission lines. And we know that these transmission lines are mostly going to be used to support the data center industry. It's important to note that this is still in the early stages. The application hasn't been submitted yet, but it has to ultimately, the approval process has to go before the Public Service Commission. So as you can imagine, we're all a little nervous about how this is going to play out. We've seen the Public Service Commission water down. Their ability to regulate and control these projects has been watered down. And I guess I'm concerned a little bit about how things are going to play out in the 2025 legislative session, if and when the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project application is put before the PSC. So I guess there's a lot of concerns about this Piedmont Reliability Project. And the biggest concern for an organization like Potomac Conservancy is the fact that it cuts through a ton of conservation easements. So there's all types of reasons why you'd want to hold a conservation easement, but most of the easements that are held by Potomac Conservancy are because they're really, really important environmental tracts of land that we want to see preserved to maintain the Potomac watershed's water quality. But you can see over 29 properties in the Piney Run watershed legacy area, which is like up in Carroll County, are going to be in the path of this proposed project. So the architects or the designers of this project have not taken into account any kind of environmental impacts. So it's running through ag land, it's running through forests, running through really ecologically beneficial areas. So the environmental community is very, very concerned about this, not to mention, a lot of issues with property rights and things like that. There's a lot of community pushback right now to this. We've seen a lot of pushback, though, fortunately, from local elected officials and state elected officials about this project. So we're hopeful that, we can see a better proposal put forward soon. There are a lot of ways that you can get involved in this issue. So right now, it's kind of like the Wild West, right? We don't have any regulations. We don't have any plan in place, but we're hopeful that learning from Virginia, we can start moving towards a plan so that data centers, which we know we need, the internet's not going anywhere. AI is only getting more and more sophisticated. We know we're going to need these data centers, but we need a plan. We need guardrails. We need regulations in place to make sure that we have what we need while also maintaining and preserving our natural resources here in Maryland. So I would encourage everyone on the call, if you're not already, make sure you know who your local and state elected officials are so you can find out where they stand on this issue. Understand how your planning and zoning works in your own community. I linked here, Frederick County, Maryland has done a really good job of making sure that their residents know about the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project. They hosted a hearing on the 9th, I believe. But every county should have a landing page similar to Frederick County, Maryland's when it comes to planning and zoning. And then finally, I really encourage everyone to sign up for emails and action alerts for their local community groups. Potomac.org is Potomac Conservancy's website. You're welcome to go on there and click, and I can keep you guys posted on what's going on at the state level in Maryland in the upcoming General Assembly session. But also check out your local riverkeeper groups, your local land trusts, get on their websites, attend their meetings and their events so that you can also learn more about what's going on in your own backyard. These data centers are not going anywhere. We're going to be seeing them throughout the state. Frederick County is just the first county that's had to deal with this issue, but we already have seen proposals in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and I think again because of the economic benefits that some have seen, we're going to start seeing them throughout the state. So Megan, that's all I have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I guess now is it Q&A time?
It sure is, yeah. And thank you as well for a really excellent look at the situation in Maryland. Yeah, I know like many folks, I'm coming to this kind of fresh. It's sort of a new thing on the horizon that certainly seems like is a high priority for land managers and advocates to start educating ourselves on as quickly as we can. So this has been a really great discussion on that front. We do have a couple questions in the queue, and I'll again welcome our audience members to participate and start adding those questions as well. We frequently get a rush during the last 2 minutes, and if you act now, you have a much better chance of having your question answered. So a couple questions from Thayer. First, are the diesel generators supplementing grid power, or are they backup for power outages?
I think the answer is both, right? So the line that they're giving us is if there's a power outage, they can use these backup generators to keep these data centers running. Because in some cases, it's a national security issue. As we mentioned, they're supporting, the federal government, they're supporting the Social Security Administration, but there have been some concerns that diesel generators are used just when it gets too expensive to run off the energy grid. So Kyle has probably some better evidence of that than I do, but there are concerns that these diesel generators are running more frequently than they have been advertised as.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So the answer is, as a general rule of thumb, they are for data center diesel generators are for emergency backup power only. However, the fear is that at least in Virginia, what constitutes an emergency is very vague. And so in Virginia, we have seen attempts, thankfully none have, to my knowledge, really come to fruition yet, but we have seen attempts to essentially say that when the grid is under strain, which would be peak load, like during the summer, hottest points in the day, data centers would do what's called load shedding. And so load shedding would mean we'll turn our diesel generators on. We won't need the power from the grid. You can send that to other factories, other businesses and homes that need it, and we will run our diesel generators. Of course, the problem with that is when those turn on, they're spewing toxic chemicals. I'm going to throw a video into the chat that I would encourage everyone to go to YouTube and watch later. This is what they look like when they run. I mean, they're spewing lots of black smoke into the air. So it's kind of like this big concern. And of course, you would do that at peak load, which would mean oftentimes in sort of the middle of the hot summer day, which sort of is going to amplify your clean air concerns. The other thing I'll add that I think is of super importance to this conversation is diesel generators don't just sit idle and off always 24/7, 365. They are permitted, depending on the diesel generator, to run about 2 hours a month. And so when you get to the quantity that we're talking about, like 4,000 in Loudoun County alone, every single day, 100 diesel generators or more than 100 diesel generators are running, right? And so I think we have to remember that even though they're not maybe running, thankfully, continuously all of the time, it's not like there's no environmental impacts. And when you get to the scale that we're talking about, this is a real problem. I'll also throw in, which is I think really important, there are alternatives to diesel generator. They're more expensive and harder to bring online. But the state of Maryland and the state of Virginia could absolutely encourage battery backup power, battery storage combined with renewable energy to provide at least an initial 3 or 4 hour backup power for data centers. Natural gas is technically also an option that's been explored. All of these would theoretically be a cleaner option than diesel.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions related to energy prioritization that I think we can kind of pair together. So John asks, are utility companies going to prioritize urban energy demand or data center demand? And Janet asks, are some servers prioritized over others? Do they all need to be powered 24/7 or do some of them go offline sometimes?
I'll tackle the 24/7 question. The answer is unfortunately data centers are extremely energy inefficient and essentially run at full speed all of the time. There are ways to reduce overall power use through energy efficiency measures, but essentially the data center model and largely the big model is essentially immediacy, right? And I kind of understand, right? Like YouTube, if you go to YouTube at midnight, you expect to have a YouTube video just as fast as if you went at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so these various data centers have to essentially be fully operational at all times. In theory, you could work with business partners to say, okay, we know you are only working 8 to 6 p.m. We're going to essentially shut everything down, but that is not the current model. And currently, there's no real incentive for businesses to do that. Most of the energy costs are kind of passed on to external clients. And so data center developer and builders and owners, they're not really seeing that impact the bottom line on their back end. And so there's no real incentive, financial incentive for them to do that at the moment. So unfortunately, the model is essentially full speed 24/7, 365.
Yeah, and to answer the question, related to how the utility companies are prioritizing this work. I mean, we're all pulling from the same grid, whether you're a private homeowner or you're a large data center. So might have even heard Microsoft recently built or bought 3 Mile Island, the site of the nuclear plant, back in the 80s and 90s, and they're starting it back up again. They're going to be pulling their own energy from that nuclear power plant. So there's a lot of concerns about like the ethics behind that and whether or not data centers are being prioritized, or even if they're not prioritizing it, if they're pulling all of this other energy, who's paying for the rate increases, right? We're seeing a lot of tax incentives for these data centers to come to the region, but the rate increases are going up for private consumers. So it's a hard question to answer. Some of it's, there's a lot of speculation around it, but we're already seeing evidence that the burden of this data center power sucking up all this power and energy in the region is being placed on consumers through their utility bills.
Thank you. So wanted to start getting a little bit into some of the policy questions that are related. So we'll start with one from Maureen, who asks, SB 861 was sponsored by Lewis Young and Ron Watson to promote more oversight, but did not pass. Any communication with them resubmitting this bill during the upcoming legislative session? And I'll also ask if you could summarize a little bit about what was involved in that bill.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, a lot of advocates are talking to members of the Maryland General Assembly right now about, both the Piedmont Reliability Project, quantum loophole, and just the data center industry in general. And so there's a lot of talk about what's going to be introduced. It's a little premature right now to talk about any specific legislation. I have not personally spoken with Senator Karen Lewis Young. She was a huge proponent of putting up guardrails and regulations last year. We're really fortunate to have her as an advocate. She represents Frederick County residents, but I have heard that she has interest in proposing similar legislation this year.
Right, and I'm also going to slip in a question of my own while we're on the policy topic. So Kyle, you had referred, and I think you gave a great summary about why green spaces are so often targeted over things like redevelopment. And are you aware of any efforts towards developing policies to disincentivize that green space development in favor of redevelopment, or of some of these other land use considerations?
Yeah, so this is a really complicated question. So let's start with the basics, which is in Virginia, and I believe for the most part in Maryland as well. Local land use decisions are left entirely up to the localities, right? And so there's not really a holistic planning process happening at the statewide level, at least in Virginia, for conversion of green space. I mean, there's the variety of policies that sort of go into protecting green space. And we have our 20 by 30 goals and all of those different things, but like kind of holistically, there aren't, to my knowledge, any immediate and definitive restrictions on developing green space, right? For what it's worth, I think you could make the case that, as a society and we're continuing to grow, we're going to need to continue to sort of grow outside of our urban bubbles in some capacity. And as long as we're doing that in a smart and sustainable way, that's not necessarily always a terrible thing, right? Like we have to have plans and that sort of thing. What I will say is state lawmakers should consider the tools that they have in their toolbox to encourage good growth. And so in the state of Virginia, one of the things that we're considering, and that I would encourage folks in Maryland to look to, is amending those tax incentives that data centers get to encourage sustainable growth, right? And so you could amend the existing tax credit to say, to be eligible for this tax credit, you must redevelop existing brownfields, right? Like you could write that into the code to say, okay, we're not going to make it illegal to develop green space, but if you want these tax incentives, we're going to prioritize smart development. And so there are ways to essentially encourage good growth without necessarily doing a blanket ban on X, Y, or Z.
Great. Somewhat related, a question from Janet. Can you give some examples of the kinds of guardrails that might be put in place that would protect public lands and air and water quality?
Kyle can give a lot of great examples, but at this point in Maryland, like all I really want are some disclosure requirements, right? Like we don't even know what we're working with right now. How much water is being used to cool these places? What kind of chemicals or components of these, like the hardware that's inside of these buildings? How is it being disposed of? That's what we're dealing with right now in Maryland, just the basics of trying to figure out what we're working with here. So, we're working on trying to get a study similar to something that Virginia has, trying to get disclosure requirements written into some of these tax incentives that they're getting. But Kyle can speak to a little bit more to some of the guardrails that, based on what they've learned in Virginia, are desperately needed.
Yeah, so you have to think, let's tackle this kind of holistically. So first and foremost, this is like an all levels of government thing, right? And so we have to be mindful that each different layer of government, in theory, has a different role to play, right? And so from the federal government all the way down to local governments and county boards of supervisors, each layer of government should be doing things to encourage and promote smart and sustainable growth. So, for instance, local governments, the state might struggle to do an outright ban on new green space development, but local boards of supervisors could 100% say, sorry, we're not approving anything in our A1, our agricultural area of our comp plan. That's off the table. Grow, build somewhere else. The state at the state level could absolutely say, we're going to institute some level of clean power purchase requirement, so that we're offsetting our growing energy need with clean and renewable energy and not bringing online new dirty fuel sources. So there's all kinds of different options at these various levels of government. And I think the answer is, not to be pessimistic, right now, nothing is really in place to my knowledge anywhere. We're kind of working in the state of Virginia from the ground up on this. As I kind of have pointed out, we are, in a sense, sort of the front lines, ground zero, if you will, for like this as a policy format. We have a bunch of policy ideas in the works in the state of Virginia, everything from disclosure requirements to clean purchase requirements to changing the tax incentives. Like we have all of these things in the works. The question becomes like, what shakes out of the General Assembly session and, what actually becomes law and all of these different things. But I think, unfortunately, to answer the question, Janet, is like, right now, there aren't any really good guardrails that exist. We are, no matter how you look at it, kind of on the cutting edge of this issue right now.
Megan,
Great.
Gary asked a question earlier, and Gary, you might actually know the answer to this one better than I do. So Maryland has a Forest Conservation Act that basically requires developers to plant trees, mitigation, right? For every tree they cut down, they have to replant a certain number. And I know that the original bill that was passed in 1991 actually exempts utility companies. So, every time you see trees cut down for power lines, those don't necessarily have to be replanted. But I'm not sure with the revised forest conservation law that passed in 2022, if that had been updated or not.
The answer is that it was updated, and originally they were not to be exempt from it, but the law, in a subsequent extension, exempted them again. So the answer is they are currently exempted as I understand it. It is also interesting to recognize that the implications in land use from the data centers currently in planning are as equal to the amount of land that is to be set aside for the achievement of the 5 million tree goal in Maryland. And that ultimately, if Kyle's projections were to hold true, the amount of land required for data centers just presently in planning, not already approved, would be ultimately more than double the amount of land required for the 5 million tree goal in Maryland. And it seems to me, from my standpoint, the basic issue you folks have raised is the one that Kyle summarized in his concluding comments a moment ago, and that is we really haven't looked at the landscaped impact in any broad collective sense for these data centers. So when it comes to air quality planning, water quality planning, tree preservation, the variety of actions required for implementation in any liberal concept of climate planning have been exempted from these early conversations, and that I'm really concerned that having overlooked them in the beginning, we've now set ourselves up on a slippery slope to try to recover some sort of authority in order to address these tax incentives, simply being a good example of the work that's already gone on to incentivize something that people just were so enamored with the economic impact, they have set aside the environmental impact, much like we have in any other area of climate planning. And I'm really pleased with the presentation you guys are making, because I think it sets the issues quite clearly that there's further discussion, further negotiation, and frankly, a strong amount of advocacy still needed in order to balance what's already proceeding forward. Did we have any other questions, Megan?
We have a few questions remaining and about 3 minutes left, so we'll maybe try to rapid fire a few. There's a few on some of the impacts that we may or may not have a great idea of at the current moment. So Thayer asks, how are they cooling the water to meet Clean Water Act regulations before returning it to streams?
The answer is we don't know because they won't tell us, right? Isn't that right, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to sort of give a non-answer on this. My answer would be like, for all intakes and discharges, there is a permit system and a permit process. I think a bigger problem that as an organization we have with water is loss from steam. So a lot of these data centers do what's called evaporative cooling, meaning they literally just put the water in as it heats up to cool down the computer systems, it evaporates as steam. And so what you actually will end up seeing is, let's say 1 million gallons a day withdrawn from the river, and then only a quarter of that returned to the river. And so you actually are losing a significant amount of water sort of to the air, lost in the sense that it's not immediately put back into the river on the backside. So I think that's a bigger concern. There are all kinds of regulations that I'm not intimately familiar with on how water needs to be cooled, or you sort of cooled back down to temperature before it's returned. This is a problem we see in all kinds of industries, whether it's power generation, nuclear power plants have this problem for sure. This is not a unique problem to data centers, and I do think, as a general of thumb, there are regulations pertaining to this. I think the bigger problem is sort of all of these other things that happen.
See, we have a couple questions about alternative power sources. I know they are, you had mentioned some of the carbon-free carbon sources that are proposed for usage, but give you two questions. One from Lee. What of thermal networks plus solar networks on their campuses to feed back into the grid to at least help provide energy? And from Janet, do you have numbers about how many acres of solar panels it would take to power a typical data center, even if there were battery energy storage systems?
So let's start with the first one on like alternative sources. As a general of thumb, our region is not well equipped at the scale that Virginia is talking about to provide, or that data centers are talking about, to provide geothermal or other forms of alternative on-site energy. In terms of on-site energy that's being discussed are hydrogen power, which is sort of this mythical thing that technically doesn't really exist, as well as small modular nuclear reactors, or SMRs, also kind of this technically mythical thing that hasn't been deployed at scale. So what we're seeing is the old model, which is, off-site nuclear, large generation, off-site nuclear gas and coal, delivering power in a linear power line to that site. So that's the old model. So unfortunately, regarding thermal and solar and that sort of stuff, at this point, we're not there yet. I think the other question is scale, like acreage scale, and it gets super wonky, right? So generally speaking, 1 megawatt of solar energy, which is enough to power 250 homes, is 10 acres. However, generally speaking, power companies build at a 4-to-1 ratio to ensure what they call latency, meaning additional power if the sun isn't shining at full blast, right? And so technically, power companies to do 1 gigawatt or 1 megawatt of solar are building 40 acres. Now, I'm going to have to do this math, but we're talking in the state of Virginia at 50 gigawatts, which is 1,000 megawatts. So 50,000 megawatts. So let's do some math real quick on my phone. 50,000 times, what did I just say? 40 is 2 million acres of solar to power Virginia data centers.
That's about a third of Maryland. Maryland is about 6 million acres. So you can see that these numbers are just outrageous. Really, there's just no way to contain them.
I think, put it frankly, at the scale that we're talking about, the answer is it can't be done.
Yes, it's not
You're
sustainable.
either gonna have to do one of two things. You're gonna either have to build less of them or make them notably more energy efficient, or B, you're gonna have to build large scale power generation that's either new nuclear or extensive new natural gas and other fossil fuel sources. Like clean energy is simple, like solar and wind will not be enough at scale to get us to net zero by 2050 to meet this and existing power demand. I don't have a real honest answer to that other than I don't think it can be done.
Well, bottom line, if you don't mind my finishing up, is that the goals we've set on climate neutrality and greenhouse gas reduction are incompatible with the astronomical growth of this industry on its present business plan. There's just no way to look at it. That otherwise, I don't think. I'm very pleased you guys have helped present the issue quite clearly, and I'd like to invite you back a year from now in October of 2025 to give us an update. So mark it on your calendar, the third Thursday of October in 2025. I want you to come back and let's talk then, focused on whether or not any new guardrails have been set in the variety of options that are currently available, because governments do have options. There are tools available, as Kyle has mentioned. There is legislation proposed, as Anna has mentioned. There are opportunities out there to help achieve innovation technologically and these kinds of economic opportunities in terms of jobs and taxes, but we cannot allow the goals we've set for climate and environment to be the sacrificial lamb to achieve them. And that's the issue that I hope we can continue to get people to focus in on, that this balance has not been struck wisely and it must be re-examined. With that said, are there any closing comments from either one of you? Megan, any closing
I
comments?
saw Kyle put his email in the chat. I did as well. So if you guys have any follow-up questions, I think I'm happy to answer, and please keep in touch.
Yeah, same. Thank you all.
You know, again, a year from today, let's take a look at it again, see where we're at, because this is an issue that is so new and so controversial that we're going to have to revisit it again in detail and see if we made any progress on it. Megan, any closing comments?
Only to thank our guests and express my appreciation for giving us a really wonderful introduction to a complex topic. So thank you very much. We'll look forward to the next round in a year.
Thank you both. Appreciate it. And friends, for all of you who've tuned in today, I want to invite you again to return next month to the next webinar on framing the future. We're going to be looking at some wonderful options on a land ethic in the future and some other issues that lie before us. Louis, we look forward to having you join us a month from today. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and good afternoon to all of you.